SaaS Talk is the preeminent global community of SaaS founders. Thousands of companies are involved with this organization, and I had to join. I've enjoyed it for many, many years, going to the conferences and other venues, and I'm glad they've built an online community.
Welcome to the SaaS Revolution Show. Esben Friis Jensen, Chief Growth Officer at Userflow. Welcome, Esben.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you on the podcast. And so we were just discussing that you are now a month in Colorado, and it's quite a nice place, somewhere I've never been. So enjoying that?
Yeah, I've been traveling around the US since the pandemic started, living in the countryside instead of in San Francisco, where I'm normally based. So it's been nice.
Do you think you can have you found a favorite spot? Is it Colorado because you've been there for a month? Will you go back to the Bay Area?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the Bay Area, but I really enjoy the nature, and especially Colorado and in Utah. But yeah, the US has a lot of beautiful places. So it's been great to explore those and all the national parks and so on.
You don't sound American, Esben, and there's a distinct accent there that I'm picking up. But we can probably get into that as we ask the first question. Who is Esben Friis Jensen?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't lost my Danish accent yet, but yeah, I'm originally from Denmark. Have lived in the US for the last 8 years, where I originally moved here because I founded a company called Cobalt together with 3 other Danish guys. And then I just stayed around. And then recently I joined Userflow as a co-founder. So it's been a fun journey. But yeah, the Danish accent I still have very much.
And why? So you're a second-time SaaS founder, Cobalt company. We know well at SaaS Talk, but we also kind of live in this bubble where we know a lot of SaaS companies, and I think not all of our listeners follow SaaS as I guess kind of as intensely as we do. But you were there at Cobalt for a good number of years, 8 years or so, something like that. But now moving on to SaaS number 2, or is it number 2? Have you done more before?
No, this is number 2. So Cobalt was my first startup, and today a 200 plus people company, so a lot bigger than when we started. And I really like the early days of building companies, so that's why one of the big reasons why I decided to leave Cobalt. Operationally, I'm still involved as an advisor, and to do Userflow instead.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I also love the early days. I mean, just like SaaS Talk, we're in our 6th year now, and we were growing, sort of like scaling. But then because of the pandemic and our core business was conferences, that obviously had quite a negative impact. So like last year, we then had to do a lot of innovation, pivoting to online and new product creation. And it kind of almost felt like, back in year 1 again and starting. And I kind of realized like, how much I really enjoy this kind of, period, compared to like, that bit more sort of mature stage. But a little anecdote there. But so with the second SaaS company, Userflow, why did you found it? What's the problem that you're solving?
So originally it was started by my co-founder, actually, Sebastian. But the reason we started the company, and also the reason I decided on joining, is that there's this whole product-led growth movement at the moment. That's one of the big reasons. But also in general, user onboarding in software is a big challenge that many SaaS companies face today. Basically, they might have amazing products, but they have a challenge in getting adoption of those products and also guiding the user to see the value as fast as possible. So those are the key things that Userflow helps on. So with Userflow, you can basically build in-app guides, product tours, and surveys inside your product, so you can better onboard or show users new features and so on, or ask them questions. And it's all done in a no-code fashion, which means that customer success managers or product managers and so on can build these flows without having to involve engineers. So that's always been the big kind of challenge, right? Is that onboarding is super important, but this other feature we're building is just that more important. And that's what developers end up focusing on. And that then deprioritizes the onboarding, which is super important for conversion and trials and adoption and retention. But now with Userflow, you can basically have your customer success team or product team build the flows instead.
Very cool. And so you mentioned Sebastian was like, let's say the first founder or the original founder.
Yeah.
How did you find Sebastian? How did you how did you two
So
connect?
Sebastian was actually one of the first customers of Cobalt back in the days, and he's also Danish. So that's why we connected. And he lived in San Francisco as well, so we became friends and then got to know each other better over the years. And Sebastian is an amazing engineer. He is really like a unicorn engineer. And he started out by building actually another product that was more like video kind of recordings of demos. And then as part of that product, he had built a product tour, and everybody was asking, how can we get that kind of product tour instead? That seemed like a cool product. And then he pivoted. So he's been building on that product for the last 2.5, 3 years. And I joined 1 year ago, basically to help grow the business and take some of the learnings I had from growing the business in Cobalt and taking them with me into Userflow.
Very cool. And is Sebastian the CEO then, and you're the
I'm
CEO?
the chief growth officer. So Sebastian is the special role of a CEO, and he's also the guy building all the stuff. So he's the CTO, CEO. Very probably not the most normal thing you see in SaaS startups, but it works for us.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like often it is the case that the developer, becomes the CEO, and at some point they need to give up the developing, right, or that role.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen that at many a SaaS company. And Userflow, what data can you share about the company in terms of how big is it now, like any revenue or growth statistics, and how many people, etc., that sort of thing, funding?
Yeah, we're very special companies in many ways. So we are part of this whole new, as well as we're part of the product-led growth movement. We're also part of this new movement where more and more startups are bootstrapping. So we are a completely bootstrap company, and we are actually just the two founders and then a freelance designer. So and he works part-time, so like 2.5 employees. But we have 7-figure ARR. We have close to coming up on 400 customers. So yeah, the business is doing really well, but we've kept the team very small and lean. So having the product really drive a lot of the growth and retention.
Congrats, that's amazing. Like 2.5 employees and 7-figure revenue. So what, like, I'm assuming that, and great obviously that you're bootstrapping, but I'm assuming some investors' emails do come into your inbox and we want a meeting. But you're just, this time we're bootstrapping. Is that it?
Yeah, that's how we're doing it. Yeah, the funny thing is when you're saying no to investors, they seem more interested, right? And if you really want to raise money, they're not so interested. But yeah, we get a lot of emails, and right now we're just saying no. We do speak with them sometimes just to understand their view on the market, right? But in general, we say no to all kind of interest in investment.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had Nathan Barry on the podcast recently, and he owns 90% of ConvertKit, and they're doing 29 million ARR, and so he's doing pretty well, right?
Yeah.
And there isn't a real need
I
to.
also think MailChimp is an amazing example that just got acquired, right? Like bootstrap from day one, and $1 billion company. So
yeah, exactly. You can do it. Well, good. I hope that you stick to the bootstrapping for as long as you can, and even
we'll
if
try.
that email comes in from Tiger Global tomorrow for 100 million, you walk away. Let's see. Good stuff. And so so the chief growth officer role, why that? Did you do that before at Cobalt?
So at Cobalt, I was the person who helped build both sales and customer success. And over time, my role kind of became like a chief customer officer more. I think in this new age, you could say, like, you could argue, should I be the chief revenue officer or should I be the chief sales officer and so on? But really in a product-led world, it's really about growth and kind of growing in other ways than the people kind of driven sales and customer success. And that's why we kind of ended up on Chief Growth Officer being the best name for that kind of role. So I'm very focused on not necessarily building a sales team or customer success team and these kind of things that I did at Cobalt, but instead looking into how can we grow in other ways. How can we make the product the main kind of growth avenue and so on.
And so this is what I guess I want to dig into. So 400 customers, 7-figure revenue, 2.5 people. Like, what secrets can you share or lessons can you share? Like, what have you been doing to grow the company? And let's learn a little bit about what's worked. And clearly, there's a lot that's working.
I think we have a unfair advantage that both Sebastian and I did a company before, right? So we of course we were not like super bankrupt or anything like when we started the Userflow, right? And that of course helps. When we started Cobalt, we didn't have that kind of money to kind of. So it was a different game, and I think when we started Cobalt, we needed investment money more, right? Pay ourselves salary and so on. Mm-hmm. But really, that's of course one unfair advantage. But then really the way we've been driving the growth is through the product, right? We are just really super focused on building the best product possible. And so that's number one thing, like really build the best product possible, listen to your customers, listen to when customers are having UX issues and fix them. Instead of hiring people to answer how you should do something, then fix it by improving the product to be better, right? Or if you cannot do that, then make like a help article or something like that will make them self-service support. So that's a big part. And then the second part is, of course, using something like Userflow, where you automate things like onboarding, right? Like with Userflow, we are automating like kind of the onboarding towards the famous aha moment. In our case, it's the realization that they can build a flow themselves. That's really like the key aha moment, and we drive them towards that as quickly as possible. But also using other automation like email automation and stuff like that. Really automate as much as you can to drive kind of both trial conversion and retention at scale. So that's how we can do it with a very small team.
And what about in terms of acquiring these customers? So obviously having a great product is going to help you get product market fit, which you've clearly got. But how did you acquire these first customers? What were you doing? Given that
the very first customers we got through Product Hunt and friends, right? Like that was like the early days. And a lot of those have left since then because they are small, right? Typically, and they're also like early stage business, and some of them go out of business, unfortunately, and so on, right? But so that was the first customers. But then over time, we started adding Google Ads. So we are in the lucky, unlucky situation that this is a red ocean market. So we have a lot of competitors, but for us, it's actually a good thing. It means there's a high kind of demand for that kind of product, and people are searching for it. And what that means is that a thing like Google Ads is actually very valuable, because if people are searching for your product, then you can make yourself found through ads, right? And so that's been a big part of our initial strategy. And then now that I've joined and so on, it's becoming increasingly like thought leadership, SEO, content, and these kind of things to add to that motion, basically. So it's been a mix. I would say in Cobalt, the funny thing was, and that was 8 years ago, and I think to this day they're still relying on it to a large extent. Of course, they have a lot of word of mouth, and we also have that at Userflow. Over time, you get more and more word of mouth, right? But we relied a lot more on outbound, right? Like basically like connecting with people via emails or LinkedIn and so on. And it was a much more effective mechanism back then. Today, I think outbound is having a lot of challenges. It's a lot easier to get, or a lot harder to get through the noise. Like email is almost impossible. LinkedIn, that was the magic tool for a long time, has now also become a noisy place, right? So it's becoming increasingly hard to do outbound. So you have to be creative and do outbound in other ways. For instance, through communities on Slack and these kind of things.
What about like, has there been some stuff that you've tried, like, I guess as chief growth officer, you may have experimented on certain things and channels that just simply hasn't worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, we tried email outbound actually. We have an automation engine, but we're seeing so low kind of response rate on that. And it's interesting, right? Because we know there's an interest in the market because people are searching for it, right? Like we get a ton of inbound from ads and SEO. But then when you write them an email, it cannot be right that they're not interested, right? Like if you write product managers and you know there's an interest in the market, but none of them respond back. And that for me shows that that channel is just too noisy, right? Like people get too many spam emails, and maybe Google is also becoming better at filtering that kind of stuff, right? So I would say emails, which was a very valuable channel 8 years ago when we started Cobalt, is, at least in my opinion, a less valuable channel today.
And moving on, I guess, to the point that you have maybe, well, let's say an unfair advantage, but certainly an advantage being a second time founder, right? So that part of it was capital because the money that you've earned through Cobalt and building that company to 200 people.
Mm-hmm.
So that helps with the bootstrapping. And you obviously then have a lot of knowledge that you've acquired over 8 years of building that business. But what will you do differently with Userflow? Keen to
Yeah, I
know.
think the main thing is really having this core focus on product-led growth, right? I think we had that in the beginning of Cobalt, but over time we realized, and I think it was especially because we were creating a brand new vertical kind of industry. So there was a lot of education in the market. So it was more blue ocean. Of course, there was all the incumbents, right? But that doesn't really count in that kind of world. So there was a lot of education to be done. And in a world where you need to educate customers, it's a lot harder to do product-led growth. So that's why I think we ended up building more and more sales, right? Like we built a sales team, we built customer success. We removed self-sign-up, right? We had self-sign-up in the beginning, but we removed that. And I think many SaaS companies have gone through that journey as they move up market and so on, right? And move up pricing and so on. But this time we're not going to do that with Userflow. We are, and I think it's also partially, of course, we're in the red ocean, but also the fact that we are just so focused on, we want this to be a pure product-led kind of motion, right? Like we want to continue on how we can empower the self-sign-ups, self-retention, and these kind of things. And I also think the market has matured a lot more, right? SaaS has become a normal thing, which it wasn't like, you would say, so it wasn't SaaS a normal thing 8 years ago? No, not really, right? Like it's matured a lot in the last 10 years. And so I think the market is also more ready, and some people are talking about what's called the end user era, right? Where the end users have the power, and that means you need to build great products that the end users like. You're no longer selling to executives where they just look at the return on investment kind of numbers, KPIs, and this kind of stuff, right? They actually you have to look at the product.
What about if you're happy to share maybe any mistakes that you made kind of first time around, that because you made those that you won't repeat again, hopefully?
Yeah, no, it's so funny, right? You make many interesting mistakes over time, but it's not like, I never felt in Cobalt we made like any huge mistakes, right? It was like all iterations, and we learned and so on. I think a big learning is always around pricing, right? Like I think we started way too low on pricing, and I think Sebastian did the same when he started Userflow. For the value you're giving, you should value your product more, right? Like, and I think many SaaS founders are in that situation, especially early stage, where they really put the value of their product too low. And actually the perception then from your customers become that this is maybe not a high value product, right? If it's so cheap. So I think that is one learning that I'm taking with me, is pricing, that you can put your pricing higher than you think. and you should not underestimate the value of your product, for sure. And then the other learning is also, and maybe that's just me, right? Like I'm not, that's maybe why we're trying to keep the team small. I'm not so sure that it always helps you grow faster to hire a bunch of people, right? I think it worked in Cobalt's case, and it's a very successful business, but it also had its complexities, right? And it became a lot more focus on building the organization instead of building the product, right? And that I think we're trying to do a bit differently. I won't say Cobalt did it wrong, because I actually think we did it the way that worked for us then, and Cobalt is, as mentioned, successful. But this time I just want to try to see if it's possible to do it in another way, and I think that's another big thing I'm taking with me.
Very cool. What about, I mean, we probably covered a couple of these in terms of advantages that you have a second time founder. We mentioned capital, and obviously there's the experience that you have. Anything beyond that, anything that you would add to kind of these two things?
Yeah, I think it's funny, right? Like how perception matters. So when we started Cobalt, we were 4 Danish founders who moved to Silicon Valley, and nobody knew us, right? And we had an amazing product, but nobody like listened to this, would listen to us, right? So it was a lot of grit and hard work to get customers, kind of like one by one. And then some magic happened when we hired Caroline Wong, who's a thought leader in the security space. Then suddenly everybody listened to us, and like now it's an amazing product, right? Like, and she was saying exactly the same things, but she had a lot of voice in the industry, right? And I think now as a second time founder, you have a lot more voice, right? You have a lot more to say. People will listen a lot more to you because of your experience, right? So it's also fair that they listen more to you when you have experience. But that's, again, an advantage that second time founders have, that you have a bigger audience, right? You can speak to more people and get your product out to more people.
Any disadvantages of being a second time founder?
Probably not, actually. I would say it's no. I think it's actually, you learn so much building startup. And as mentioned, Cobalt was our first startup, right? So we learned so many things. Like we had to learn sales, we had to learn customer success, we had to learn automation. So a lot, like a thing like automation, right? That was like an iterative process we did in Cobalt. But now I can just, off the shelf I know how to do the automation that we did in Cobalt, right? So that saves me a ton of time. And it's the same with Sebastian, because he's built companies before. He knows exactly how to build like the baseline SaaS product, right? And that speeds up things a lot, right? So yeah, I think there's only advantages to having that experience. Really, I don't see any disadvantages as such.
If we just sort of round up maybe a couple of the key takeaways from your experience to date with Userflow, what would you distill them down into, like, a couple of points?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do you have in mind? Like experiences with Userflow, what we've seen, or kind of like?
Yeah, well, I guess in this time round of building the company from from zero to the
no, I think
revenue, like the key.
We've shown that it's possible to bootstrap a company, right? And bootstrap it to a size where many people are saying, how can you do that, right? Like, how can you have 7-figure ARR with 3 people? That doesn't sound possible, but it is, right? If you have the right team and especially a strong engineer, right? I think that's a need to have in that kind of world, right? Like somebody who can really build a strong product that's user friendly. But I think we've seen that you can do that, and that's been a big takeaway for me, is like you can really use the product to drive growth without having to hire a bunch of sales or customer success people. And it's really a mindset that you think product first instead of thinking we should hire somebody to fix this, right? So that's probably the biggest takeaway for me.
What about either any advice you've been given, like over the years, that you feel would be shareable, or just any advice that you personally could share?
I think that's the amazing, and especially on our journey with Cobalt, right? We met so many amazing advisors and investors. We were part of an accelerator called Boost VC in the Valley, who's led by Adam Draper. And he's really good at like coining terms like beat a cockroach and stay focused on one thing. I think that's also super important, and something that when you have a great engineer like Sebastian, he can build everything, right? So it's super important to still stay focused, to keep a clean positioning. And we are highly focused on user onboarding, right? We could be focused on employee onboarding for like Salesforce or whatever, but we are not, right? Like we stay super focused on customer user onboarding for SaaS businesses. So that's another big one I think I took with me. So the focus thing I think is super important. And then the last thing is just don't over-engineer things, right? Like really keep, and that's probably a learning more than an advice I've gotten, is like there's a tendency to try to over-engineer every single decision, every single thing. And especially when you are like in a sales-led world and trying to become more product-led, you're like debating all sorts of things like, should we do this and how do we do this perfectly, right? But really what you should do is iterate and learn, right? Like do simple improvements and iterate and keep it simple. Don't try to build like super complex things. I see it all the time with Userflow, right? The customers who are most successful with Userflow are actually the ones who start out with like simple kind of usage of it, right? Maybe a simple onboarding checklist with some simple flows. And then over time, they can make it more kind of advanced, right? But they shouldn't start out with the advanced setup. Then it becomes hard to maintain and so on.
Awesome. Some great advice there. And I guess kind of finally, Esben, where can people find you online, and where can people check out Userflow?
So I'm on LinkedIn, so you can connect with me there. I'm also on Twitter, Esben FJ. And I'm also very active in a community called productled.com that has a Slack community for product-led growth, very good community. Then for Userflow, you can go to userflow.com very easily. And we have a 14-day free trial. You can build a flow without involving engineers. When you actually have to deploy it, you have to install a small piece of JavaScript. But when you do the trial, you can use a Chrome extension and get started right away. So.
Awesome. Good stuff. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing with the SaaS community. Been great speaking to you, Esben Friis Jensen, CGO at Userflow, and best of luck with continued bootstrapping.
Thanks, Alex. It was my pleasure.